years to an endless witch hunt. Were it not for the fact that a prominent member of his own party, also a chair of the powerful committee, the House Science Committee, Chairman Bolin, stood up and called out his own Republican colleague for, in language stopping just short of calling him a modern-day Joe McCarthy. And so suddenly you have this battle between these two titans, these two House Committee chairs. And had it not been for what I consider the brave actions of Sherwood Boehlert, it probably cost him his political career. He did not run again. He retired in 2005, probably because he would not be reappointed to the chairmanship of that committee, and he might not even be able to win. He'd probably be primaried because of the actions that he took. But he knew that it was the right thing to do. And so the greatest hero in our story turns out is a Republican. And I think it actually emphasizes something very important, that the debate over human-caused climate change, it wasn't that long ago when it wasn't such a political partisan issue, and it shouldn't be a political partisan issue. I mean, after all, I have friends who are Republicans as well as Democrats, and I know that they care every bit as much as their children about their children and grandchildren, the world that they leave them, as I do mine. And as my Democratic friends, my Republican friends, they care equally about the world that they leave their children, grandchildren. And that's what this is really about. It's about the legacy of, what sort of world do we want to leave the next generation? Do we want to leave them a degraded planet, or do we want to take the precautions necessary to confront this challenge head on? We can have a good faith debate about what policies to enact in dealing with this problem. I was just down in Woods Hole for several days in a workshop on sea level rise, where scientists were brought together with stakeholders, government representatives, who are all trying to think about adaptation strategies for how, for example, New England is going to deal with the threat of rising sea level. There's a good faith debate to be had about, issues of adaptation and, of course, mitigation, what we need to do to shift away from our reliance on fossil fuels in time to stabilize the climate, below where we really start to get into changes that are so profound and so detrimental that there's literally no way we can adapt to them in a meaningful way. We can have a good faith debate about that, but we can no longer have a good faith debate about the reality of the problem. We can't continue to bury our heads in the sands, and and that's literally taking place. I don't know how many of you have followed this case in North Carolina, where there's legislation that they attempted to pass, legislating how sea level rise could be estimated, and basically they wanted to predicate that that projections of sea level rise would be based on an unreasonable assumption that would minimize the threat. So I joked, in terms of the coastal inundation, as beaches are eroded by sea level, that they literally wanted to bury their heads in that sand. Those legislators who wanted to legislate away the problem of climate change. And I joked actually at the time that maybe we should bar hurricanes from entry into the U.S. We should simply mandate that they're not allowed to cross our borders and turn them away when landfalling hurricanes threaten the east coast of the U.S. There are a whole family of policies we could envision passing, but it's not a serious discussion, and we have to get back to the serious discussion. We have to have a serious discussion about what steps we're going to take to make sure that we preserve the earth for our children and grandchildren, that we don't leave them a degraded planet. And so I guess that's the note that I'll leave it on, and I'll be more than happy to entertain questions for 20, 30 minutes, as long as you folks want to go. Thanks.
Yeah. So you talked about your childhood, about your science childhood, but a lot of your book is like quotes from generals and things like that about how you, once you got into the fight. So I have a thing I want to add as a comment, but my actual question is if you could share some experience your child, maybe your father, your mother, some uncle, some things that now when you're fighting all these people, you could draw on that. And then, but my actual thing I wanted to comment on was that, do you find that, do you have like a story of people that have, a lot of this is, that have converted, like, I think like what's interesting to me is like the people that seem to be the most against this is, there's other implications, and not just if you're a fossil fuel person, but you have to now think in a non-nationalistic way, you have to think in a planetary way, you have to now not think about a year from now, like there are some people who don't even know what they're doing this New Year's Eve, they don't want to think about 100 years from now, like, so you have to now think, so that there is a whole lot of other implications where you're now forcing people to think about 2100. Who wants to do that? And so then I think, have you been able to figure out how to overcome all these other resistance? Not just the fossil fuel industry. It's like things about people. Know, if you've got this American flag in your hand, then why should I care about the Bangladesh floods that will now wipe out Bangladesh? I don't know. So, but I'd love to hear some stories from your childhood that helped you kind of resolve through the fight.
Well, there's a lot of great food for thought in those comments, and I could talk for hours about a lot of those the interesting questions you raised. You know, I suppose in my childhood, I was a bit of a, you know, I suppose at times I was a bit of an unruly child. I sometimes got in trouble with my teachers because I didn't want to, you know, if I felt something was wrong, I was told to do something, I didn't want to do it, and you know, and so I was, you know, I was a bit of a feisty child, and maybe cantankerous, a little cantankerous at times, and you know, maybe that has served me well. Maybe you know that feistiness.
Did you witness any adults in some principled fight?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, I think that as a child you have a sense that there's certain things in the world that are wrong, and you question why are they that way, and why isn't somebody doing something about this? And it's hard for me off the top of my head to come up with a specific example, but sure, you know, I suppose that's sort of what I mean by having that feistiness, that I felt like there were certain things that were wrong, and it wasn't right to just accept them because you were told that that's what the way things were supposed to be. And it got me into a little bit of trouble in elementary school. I got locked up in the timeout room more than once for that sort of feistiness. So, you know, I suppose that I've retained that, and it maybe has served me well in, you know, the battles that I've been through when I found myself at the center of these attacks over the issue of climate change. In terms of, you know, the second part of your question, you know, I think that this is a really difficult problem for people to get their heads around because we're talking about time horizons, like you say, centuries. You know, we're talking about sea level rise by 2300. You know, what does that mean? 2300? You know, I think 2300. Aren't we going to have flying saucers that can take us off to other planets?
You heard the Dennis Mill line, like, I care about my children, I care about my grandchildren, and my when my great-great-grandchildren, I'm never going to see them.
Right? No, that's right. And so there's this disconnection both in time and also in space, as you allude to, that, hey, it's especially in time, I'll get to you in a moment, you know, in these times of, you know, difficult economic pressures that we have domestically, that it's so easy to dismiss problems that are more abstract and are more removed, like you say, you know, with people who are stuck being flooded in Bangladesh, people who are, you know, far away, these problems that seem so distant. It's easy, I suppose, at some level to dismiss them when you have more immediate problems to confront. You know, bread and butter issues like, you know, just making it from paycheck to paycheck. And I think that's in part why it has been such a challenge to garner sort of the will to deal with this particular issue, which seems so distant, and some of the impacts seem so foreign and so far afield at a time when we're struggling with other day-to-day issues. The problem, of course, is that climate change is going to impact all of those other pressures that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Climate change is going to impact them, whether you're talking about human health, whether you're talking about the availability of fresh water, and not just in other parts of the world. I mean, we're seeing, you know, as I speak, we're seeing right now in the continental U.S. What I would argue is an attributable climate change impact. The massive forest fires that we're seeing right now in Colorado, that we saw in New Mexico, when you look at them in context, they're part of a pattern where, you know, we're seeing warmer and warmer temperatures, we're seeing earlier and earlier snow melt, and so there's less moisture, there's more fuel for fires in the warm season. We are seeing changes in the circulation of the atmosphere that are favoring an expansion of sort of the belt of deserts, of dry subtropical air that's migrating north, and we can measure that. We see that happening in the data. And so, you know, some of the disasters that we're seeing unfolding have a climate change component. Before the presentation, I was talking with some folks about Hurricane Irene, which you know, you guys felt here, especially in the western part of the state, especially in northern New England, and we felt the effects of record flooding in Pennsylvania. And when I talk about that, you know, the first thing I point out is that we can't say that Hurricane Irene happened because of climate change. There's no way to say that. But what we can say is that that hurricane was actually developing over near record sea surface temperatures off the east coast of the U.S. And that means that that storm contained more water vapor than it otherwise would have contained because of those unusually warm ocean temperatures. And that means there was more moisture available to produce rainfall. And so why that storm produced such record rainfall over this large swath of the northeastern U.S., I believe that there was a component of that that's related to climate change. And I could go on and on. I guess the point is simply that whether you're talking about human health, whether you're talking about national security, anything that we might care about, regardless of our politics, is going to be impacted increasingly in a negative way by the pressures of climate change. And so, sure, thanks. Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, I see you're talking about fossil fuel industries and all that. You being a scientist, is there ways that future can develop other kinds of energy to get away from fossil fuel? Because what they've done so far, they polluted the Gulf, but they saved it. And that could happen on the East Coast because they're looking to put more. As we're running out of oil, they'll just say more, until somebody, you know, changes our industries to it.
Well, it's interesting because there have been all these reminders of the hidden costs of our reliance on fossil fuels that are becoming increasingly difficult to recover. Whether it's the Gulf oil disaster, the Deep Horizons oil disaster, it's because we have to go deeper and deeper into places where if we screw up, if we create a leak. You know, it wasn't clear that we had the engineering technology to plug the leak, and we got lucky. We eventually.
Well, I heard that there's a place up above Alaska with a lot of oil, and they wouldn't dare because they would pollute so much water if there was ever a disaster.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able to get all that infrastructure that we have down in the Gulf up to a remote place like the North Slope of Alaska. So if we were to start drilling, at similar depths, the North Slope of Alaska, and something like that happened, it would be that much more difficult to actually contain the problem. History reminds us that it's all too easy to create a problem that you can't actually solve.
And there goes our fresh water.
Well, and we're already seeing, even years later now, ecologists are seeing some persistent, very damaging impacts on the entire, ecosystem of the Gulf of Mexico because of the effects of that leak. Or if you're talking about coal and mountaintop removal, removing the tops of mountains to get at that increasingly difficult to get at coal, or mining the tar sands up in Alaska, which is creating a potential environmental disaster as well. So those are let me finish the point, and I'll be happy to entertain a follow-up. And those are just, and I haven't even talked about climate change. Those are just externalities, direct externalities of impacts on our environment that aren't factored into the economics of fossil fuels. There is no penalty, other than pretty minimal sanctions that were imposed. There's no penalty on the destruction to the environment. It's a cost that we all bear by a degraded environment, but it isn't factored into the cost-benefit analysis of the fossil fuel industry. That's what, it's what's known as the tragedy of the commons. And if you don't internalize that cost to the environment into the economic decision-making process, then you're going to incentivize exactly the wrong types of energy. And so climate change, I haven't even talked about climate change. Now if you take into account the climate change impact of emitting carbon into the atmosphere, of using fossil fuels, and if you calculate the damages down the road from that behavior, it turns out that it makes a lot more sense from an economic standpoint to incentivize other sources of energy. Now, getting away from fossil fuels to taking advantage of wind and solar.
That's
and
what exactly I was
geothermal
thinking. Solar.
and hydrothermal. I was just returned from Iceland a few weeks ago, where they are essentially able to provide all of their energy needs, or just about all of their energy needs, from non-carbon-based energy. Now, they are fortunate; they have resources that the rest of us don't. But they're actually an example of how it can be done. And the problem, of course, is that we haven't put in place the incentive structure necessary to encourage that shift away from fossil fuels, where we are giving huge subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So we're encouraging the use of fossil fuels, and we're not providing similar subsidies to wind and solar and other non-carbon-based energy sources. That's so. The argument, how we do that, how we impose that incentive structure. Does it mean cap and trade or a carbon tax? I mean, the mechanics of how you go about that. Again, there's a good debate to be had about how we go about that, and how we price that, and how we do that calculation. But it's clear that we're doing exactly the wrong thing right now, and what's even more absurd is that the rest of the world recognizes that. Right? So we've got China and India and the rest of the world moving ahead and investing far more heavily in renewable energy. They see that. They see that that's the future of the global economy. And here in the U.S., instead, we're having a debate about whether we should be going after coal or natural gas. Which fossil fuel should we be incentivizing? We're falling behind the rest of the world, and it's a matter of competitiveness. It's a matter of economic competitiveness. So whether or not you care about the impacts on our environment, the impacts on human health, if you care about American competitiveness, you should be upset that we're allowing the rest of the world to move ahead and develop non-carbon-based energy sources, while we continue to have this absurd debate about which fossil fuel we should be exploiting. Another question? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brad Johnson.
Hey, Brad. Okay. Not sure we've ever.
I just came over from the 350.org organizing meeting around the corner, which is pretty great too. One thing I'm interested
a little bit
in.
Of competition.
Yeah, no, it's
in Cambridge today.
Yeah,
it's a good kind of competition.
Yeah, so there's basically all the climate activists in the area are meeting right now over, which is pretty cool. One thing I'm wondering about is, and I feel like you have kind of a special perspective on this, is like the challenge for scientists, like when they kind of intersect with the kind of political system and society, especially, but just from the perspective of like the idea of like the cultural role of scientists and like within the community, like that it's kind of seen as scientists who engage with the public or kind of identifies themselves as like American citizens kind of often lose their lose their own legitimacy just within the scientific community. And I'm wondering just kind of how you see that and how you've dealt with it, and also just kind of like if you see ways of like if the right thing for scientists to do is recognize that they're part of the political process, or if they try to disengage entirely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's something we all struggle with. I think every scientist who ventures into the public sphere has to sort of has to struggle with this. What is our role as a scientist? What's our role as a citizen? How do we distinguish between them? How do we clarify when we're being one and when we're being the other? Is it appropriate to wear both hats? And how clear should we be when we're wearing one hat and not the other? And in the book, I try to give a sense of my own evolution as a very naive graduate student and postdoc who found myself in the center of this debate that I had never intended to get involved in when I studied physics and math, and and I never thought that I would be at the center of some big political scandal, debate, maelstrom, and I try to describe my evolution, my own thinking, and my own personal evolution as over time as I found myself at the center of these attacks. And I learned about where these attacks are coming from and why I'm being subject to these attacks. It very much changed my perspective. It did lead me to believe that that we do have a greater role. Scientists who are working in this area and have found ourselves for whatever reason in the center of the public discourse and the public debate. We have a responsibility to, I think as citizens, because we're in a unique position. Arguably, we understand the science and its implications better than others who haven't spent their lives studying this problem, and that means we have something important to contribute to the debate. In particular, we have a role in making sure that the policy debate is informed by an accurate discussion, an accurate assessment and discussion of the science and its implications. And some people will turn around and say, well, you're an advocate then, you've become an advocate. And what I say is, if you mean by advocate, if you mean advocating for the proposition that the policy debate over this issue should be informed by an accurate assessment and an accurate discussion of the science, then by all means, call me an advocate. I proudly wear the mantle of advocate.